The Living Zen-podcast is a gift from the Victoria Zen Centre. If you enjoy it, please forget about making a donation. Instead, just share it with a friend that you think will enjoy it as much as you did. You may also consider purchasing the Living Zen-podcast app, which is available for iPod, iPhone, and Android. If you happen to visit or reside in Victoria, British Columbia, I'd like to invite you to attend the Tuesday evening Zen open house that takes place every week at the University of Victoria's Interfaith Chapel. This event is co-sponsored by UVic Multifaith Services and the Victoria Zen Centre. For more information, please visit our website at zenwest.ca. Tonight I want to talk about something that I think affects all of us, something that really impacts the way that we go about making relationship in this world and with the people in it, with the objects in it. And that's fear. One of the things that I'm always talking about in this meditation group is our fixation, our obsession with the idea, the concept of this thing that we call self. When we first take up the posture of seated meditation, we begin to develop this ability, this faculty of awareness. We begin to sharpen and deepen our awareness. And as we do so in this practice of seated meditation, walking meditation, formal practice, I guess we can call it, we begin to observe, we begin to become aware of how we carry this thing that we call a self. This thing that we call a self is something that, for the most part, for most of our lives, tends to sort of fly under our radar. We kind of just take it for granted. But it shows up when we find ourselves being challenged, when we find ourselves in difficult situations or faced with choices. And we say things to ourselves and to others like, I don't like that, or that's not my style, or that's just not the way I do things, or that's not me. And what we find when we begin to take up this practice is that there's virtually no aspect of our lives, no aspect of how we carry ourselves or express ourselves or feed ourselves or clothe ourselves or decorate ourselves that we haven't very specifically, very carefully chosen how we go about doing things. I guess I've used the word chosen. Maybe that's not the best word, but it's a way that we have elected, a way that we continue to perpetuate going about the business of doing our lives. And for the most part, we don't think about it. For the most part, we don't consider even the slightest possibility that there may be another way to do things. As we take up this practice, as we, as I said, begin to cultivate this practice of awareness, we begin to witness. We begin to see the functioning of the self, this thing that we call a self. We begin to witness the interactions, the relationships between ourselves and others, between ourselves and objects, between ourselves and the world that we live in. And what we begin to see is that there is a presence of this emotion many times. That we find ourselves bound to particular habits or particular patterns of behavior. Not for any reason that we can see, but because of familiarity, because of repetition, because of conditioning, because of a habit. And as we continue to investigate this, as we continue to find a seat of stability, as we continue to clarify our mind and our eyes and our senses. More and more we can begin to question why. Why is it that I go about the business of doing this in such and such a way? Why is it that I hold this perspective of A or B on this particular subject? Where does that come from? Dogen Zenji, a Zen master from 1200 in Japan, made a formula, or gave this sort of expression of how Zen practice goes forward. To study Zen is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened, or to find oneself in all things. And this activity continues ceaselessly. Many people, when they come to engage in Zen practice, when they hear about this kind of a teaching, they skip very quickly to this whole to be awakened by all things. We forget this. To study Zen is to study the self. The first aspect of our practice is to become intimately, deeply familiar with our own habits and patterns, with our own choices and preferences, with our own fears and aversions. As we sit, and for a long time, as we begin our practice, we are becoming more and more familiar, more and more intimate with what this thing we call I is, how it goes about interacting in the world. And what we find is that the more fixed, the more rigid, the more solid, the more committed we are to who it is that we think we are, the more rigid we are in our ways of interacting and making relationship. As we begin to deepen in our practice, as our awareness clarifies, we begin to see that more and more the way that we go about our lives is limited by fear. The fear of death is the fundamental fear, but not always just this big organic body death, but the fear of change as death, the fear of potential as death, the fear of capacity, limitless, boundless capacity as death. As we develop as human beings, we begin to identify ourselves. We begin to find ourselves, we like to say. We begin to practice ways of being and interacting. The ones that work, we fixate, we attach to, and we say, this is me. When we find something that makes us feel good or makes us feel comfortable or happy, even momentarily, we say, oh, yes, this is my style. This is me. This is how I like things. And when we find things that make us uncomfortable or that we find unpleasurable or difficult, we say, oh, that's not me. That's not my style. I'm not like that. And as we grow older, we rehearse these patterns over and over and over again. Rather than recognizing them as dynamic activities, interactions in relationship, we take these things, we take our self, this concept, this idea, this thought, this preference, and we make it into something which is real, something which is solid, something that's separate from everything outside of the world. Outside in the world, sorry. Isn't this the case when you think about yourself? Do you not think about me in here and those things out there? And this can be a helpful perspective. It can be a helpful way of understanding the world, helps us interact and helps us move around safely. But when we take this as being the way things are, when we take this self, this idea of I, as something which is solid and fixed, we make a dangerous mistake. We are creating something, a solid, an object, where there is no object. There's nothing solid. Even a brief investigation of this thing that you call self, that we call I, will reveal that there is no aspect of it which remains unchanged. Not just from child to adult to old age, but even from moment to moment, our ideas, our feelings, our physical bodies change. We can see, using just our own senses, our own experience, that there is no single aspect of this thing that I call I which remains solid. And yet we give it this characteristic of solidity, of permanence. And when we make this mistake, in Buddhism, this is called ignorance, or I prefer to call it fundamental confusion, because it's not the lack of knowledge about something that is, it is the imposition of the idea of something that actually isn't. Based on this mistake, based on this confusion, we begin to relate to the world in a way which is based on fear. We think that we've got this thing and we need to protect it. We think that we've got this thing and we need to increase it. We think that we've got this thing and we need to improve it, and we need to polish it, and we need to inflate it so that it can be bigger and better and stronger and smarter and more beautiful than all of the other things that are out there. But what we find is that the more we grasp, the more we fear losing. The more we purify ourselves, the more we fear contamination, impurity. The more we make ourselves stronger, the more we fear weakness. I think you can sort of follow this along. So that what happens is that we are conditioned and encouraged and supported to pursue a life which is about making the self into more and more and more. But each step that we take on this path, each goal that we pursue, and indeed each goal that we accomplish, only increases this fear of its loss. This is the game that we play when we fixate and hang on to this idea of self, this idea of inside and outside. When we take up this practice, that what's asked of us is to, first of all, recognize this, become aware of our attachment, become aware of our fixation and our commitment to this idea of ourselves existing as something solid, something fixed, something permanent, and something separate. And having become aware of this, to engage in a practice which is terrifying, which is utterly frightening, which is to willingly, courageously, to walk towards death, which is to say, that we practice in this activity of breathing, allowing this perspective, this hold that we have on this idea of self to soften. That we practice in this simple activity of sitting, what does it mean to allow ourselves to dissolve into the experience of breathing? To allow ourselves to dissolve into the experience of simply manifesting in this room together with all things. We practice softening and letting go of this conceptual, intellectual idea of a wall, a barrier between inside and outside. We begin to experience our world with all of the senses, not as something somehow cut off from us, but a dynamic activity with which we are intimately connected each and every moment of our lives. We begin to experience practices like walking, not as I walking in a group of other people in a room somewhere, but allowing this gap, this separation between inside and outside to melt away so that I can experience what it is to be a part of this vast cosmos manifesting as the activity of walking. In chanting, not my voice, not me saying something, but to allow this activity to manifest as a complete whole, with nothing outside, to experience what it is to be one. For many people, this experience is very strange, unnerving. This experience, in traditional terms, is called death. When we have this experience, there is no concern for the self. There is no thinking about what so-and-so would think or how do I look. And if we are practicing awareness, when we're engaged in these activities, sitting, walking, chanting, we can actually witness the birth and death of self. We can experience what it is to be completely immersed in the activity that we're engaged in. And we can witness the birth of the self, whose first thought is always, what about me? What am I doing? Am I okay? And continuing on, re-engaging with the breath, allowing this concern to melt away, allowing the fear to dissolve into the experience of unconditional love. These are the two activities I'm always talking about: birth and death, plus and minus. This activity of fear is one of rigidity, calcification, solidifying, objectifying. Its opposite activity, dissolution, is one of a mother's love, completely unconditional, completely undifferentiating, intimately embracing the environment and all things in it, recognizing them as nothing other than ourselves. As we go about our lives, I think, it's very important for us to take this awareness, this clarity that we cultivate, that we experience and recognize, perhaps for the first time through formal practice, and begin to apply it in each and every moment, in each and every turn, in each and every activity of our work, of our relationships, of our families. We need to be able to witness the arising of self. We need to be able to viscerally experience what it is when fear arises, how that cuts us off from the dynamic activity that's unfolding in each and every moment, the dynamic activity of our lives. When we engage, when we interact with our lives from the perspective of being an object which is separate from other objects, we take something that is fundamentally whole and cut it. We chop it up. Wu Men, a Chinese Zen master, calls living like this living like a ghost. Just experiencing our life as a fragment of what life is. When we are brave, when we're courageous, when we're able to allow the fear to dissolve, when we're able to manifest this unconditional love for our lives, for the situation as it arises before us, we're able to not just understand, not just conceptualize, but to experience with our whole body, to experience with everything what it is to be alive, what it is to be completely unified, not separate from this dynamic activity which is unfolding as all things in this vast cosmos. It's a big order. It's a frightening prospect. It's easy for us as we sit here to think, oh, no, that's not me. That's maybe a Buddha's realization or a holy person's way of meditating. But this is the point of Zen practice. This is the point of the Buddha's teaching, that this isn't the reward or the treasure that somebody can experience at the end of a long life of practice, but that this is the activity which is taking place in this very moment, in each and everything. And it is only our ignorance, it is only this fundamental confusion about what's going on that obscures it. It's not an experience or a power or a transaction that we need to somehow find that's out there that we don't have. It's happening right under our noses in each and every moment. All we need to do is wake up. Thanks for listening to the Living Zen podcast. If you follow Living Zen through iTunes, I would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to let me know what you think about it by rating or reviewing the podcast, so that new listeners can also hear what you have to say. Thank you for your time and for your support.